Let us continue then talking about the role of the president as legislator in chief. In this part of that discussion, we will talk about uh, other ways in which the president can advance an agenda through the U.S. Congress, and we'll see that that means working closely with individual members of Congress, submitting a budget that telegraphs legislative priorities, working to elect members of the president's own party when possible, and then finally, signing statements. All right, let's get started. So as promised, we'll talk about how the president can advance an agenda, work it through Congress, by working directly with members of Congress, typically congressional leadership, right? So in the House, that would be working closely with the Speaker of the House, working with the House Majority Leader, House Minority Leader, House Majority Whip, House Minority Whip, perhaps members of chairs of key committees. In the Senate, Senate Majority Leader, Senate Majority Whip, Senate Minority Leader, Senate Minority Whip, key members of Senate committees that deal with the legislation that the president is interested in. Some presidents are better at this than others. And if you're good at it, if you're interested in that approach, if you're a people person like Lyndon B. Johnson or Ronald Reagan, you've got two basic choices. You can use the stick, right? The threat, the arm twisting, the ominous threats. That's what LBJ was all about, right? He was a scary dude, no question about it. You see him here using a little bit of his famous body language to intimidate a member of Congress. He's got the guy leaned up against the desk there. He's leaning into him. He's a big guy, LBJ, well over 6 feet tall, huge hands. He intimidated people, got right in their faces. He knew where the bodies were buried, right? He was in the Senate for many years, in the House for many years. So when it came time to get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, he knew where the bodies were buried. He knew what kind of threats to issue to get support. This guy did not mess around and do not cross Lyndon B. Johnson. So he was very effective at working with members of Congress. That clearly helped him move his legislation through Congress, especially the Civil Rights Act of '64. Conversely, if you're a people person and you're more positive, you're talking more like Ronald Reagan. He was very good at using the carrot approach. He would offer support. He would offer to have a drink with Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill. He would invite members of Congress to the White House. He would give them a tour. He would give them White House tchotchkes like cufflinks and ashtrays and presidential seal ties and that sort of thing. So he was always good at that. That can also work. Different styles for different presidents. That was more Reagan's style. He had to work mostly with a Democratic-controlled Congress, but he was good at it. He was good at working with Speaker of the House, liberal Democrat Tip O'Neill out of Massachusetts. Quite impressive, right? Working across party aisles to get things done, to get federal tax cuts, to get military growth. The irony here is Jimmy Carter, Democratic president, did not like to work with Tip O'Neill, even though he was a fellow Democrat. Tip O'Neill did not much care for Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not a people person. His approach was, here's my agenda, it's the right thing to do, now do it. And then he would largely walk away. So some presidents are just like that. They're not comfortable working one-on-one with members of Congress. Carter was not, manifestly. John F. Kennedy was clearly not. And then Barack Obama, I think he fits into that camp. So some are a little more distant, a little more aloof from Congress. Others are much more involved. LBJ and Reagan stand out as more involved with just different approaches. Another thing a president can do to move an agenda through Congress, use the budget, right? The president typically will propose a budget to Congress. The Congress responds to that proposal. And what can you do with a budget? You can make it clear with your budget priorities what your legislative priorities are. This is what Sandoval did, right, as governor of Nevada in the last legislative session. He made it very clear, this is my policy agenda, is to bolster public education. How do I indicate that? I indicate it in my damn budget. I propose raising taxes north of $1 billion over 2 years. And where's that money going to go? For public education K through 12. That made it manifestly clear what his legislative agenda was. A president can also work to elect fellow members to Congress, right? Because the more Congress is of the president's party, the more cooperative Congress will be. That may be the single most important factor. Getting a Congress that is the same party as the president. Barack Obama could be the second coming here right now, and it wouldn't matter, right? Because Congress is controlled by Republicans, both houses. That's pretty fatal to working with Congress. So what does the president benefit from? Having a Congress that shares the president's party affiliation. How can you help make that happen? Campaign for them in elections. Now that often does not work. Now when Obama was elected first time in 2008, right, he was very popular. He helped bring into Congress Democrats. A popular presidential candidate helps members of the president's party further down the ticket. So no question, some Democrats got elected to Congress in 2008 that normally wouldn't have gotten elected, but they benefited from having a Democratic candidate that was super popular. By 2010, Obama was no longer very popular, largely because of the Affordable Care Act, and so his ability to campaign for members of his own party in 2010 was very limited. I'm sure most Democrats were like, please, Mr. President, don't campaign on my behalf. You're not that popular. All right, because typically the president loses seats in a midterm. An exception to that was 2002, probably a result of 9/11. W. Bush was popular going into the 2002 midterms. And what did he do? He used that popularity to campaign hard for Republicans running for Congress. And he did help them, right? Help them significantly. Instead of losing seats in that election, Republicans picked up, I think, 1 or 2 Senate seats and a handful of seats in the House. Very unusual in a midterm. And Bush helped make that happen by being popular, but also by campaigning actively on behalf of Republicans running for Congress. Finally, a president can use signing statements to advance his or her agenda. These are somewhat dodgy, a little bit sketchy here. What are they? The president will take a law submitted to him or her by Congress. The president will sign it into law, but then the president will attach to that some additional material that says, while I have endorsed this law, I will not enforce this provision. I believe it to be unconstitutional. I will not enforce that provision. I believe that to be unconstitutional. I will not enforce some additional provisions because I believe them to be inconsistent with previous federal law. And then that's what the president will do. The president will not enforce those parts of the law with which he disagrees. That's a signing statement. They don't necessarily have the force of law, but they do signal what the president will prioritize in terms of execution and what the president will not prioritize in terms of execution. So on the one hand, right, you would say, well, there's some legitimacy there because any chief executive will enforce some laws more than others, right? Chiefs of police know this in spades. You don't tell your officers to bust every single person who breaks any possible law because then you'd be busting a lot of jaywalkers and those who did a rolling stop and all sorts of relatively minor things, 1 or 2 miles over the speed limit. Any police chief is going to say, yo, people, do not go after the little fry, go after the big fry. So speeding 10 miles above the speed limit, maybe, prioritize. Brutal murder, hey, prioritize over jaywalkers. So any executive does that. They say, we've got scarce resources, I have my priorities, these laws will get priority, these laws will not get priority. So in a sense, right, that's what the president is doing with these signing statements. But on the other hand, right, you're like, hey, wait a minute. That sounds like the line item veto, a form of line item veto applied to ordinary legislation. That makes it seem a little sketchy, right? It's almost like the president acting as a legislator, changing laws after they've been passed to his or her own liking. That's worrisome, right? That's more worrisome, thought of in that way. So there are 2 ways of thinking about these signing statements. They've been done for a long time, going back many administrations, but it is notable, W. Bush, no question about it, probably at the behest of Vice President Dick Cheney, W. Bush used signing statements far more aggressively than any previous president and far more aggressively than President Obama. He was super careful about rejecting any part of any law that he believed infringed upon his Article 2 powers as Commander-in-Chief of the military, arguing that in certain cases, national security did not allow him to enforce certain legal provisions. Dick Cheney was almost certainly the impetus behind that trend. But Obama has been far more sparing with these signing statements. Previous presidents used them quite sparingly. So that seems to be the solid tradition. W. Bush was a bit of an exception to that. So whether they're right or wrong, and that's debatable, they are certainly a tool at the president's disposal in terms of shaping legislation by indicating this is what I'll enforce and this is what I perhaps will not enforce or enforce rather less.